in some cases, what we do is we create a practice of idolatry, where we say, I'm just going to focus on this one aspect of how I'm called to know God. And when you actually examine the scriptures and you ask it with a fierceness, Lord, would you rather that I understand you and know you or feel you? Before you finish saying the word feel, he would say understand. This is his prayer for his people in John 17. Jesus says that they would know you and the one that you have sent. Jen Wilkins, an amazing theologian, she says, the heart can't love what the mind doesn't know. Vodi Bakum, he's an amazing evangelist preacher, and he says, we have a generation of believers in America, a group of young people, not your generation, he's talking about my generation, that fervently and passionately worship a God they don't know. And so we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and the combination of all these different disciplines comes together to lead to a deeper worship. My hope is this: as we get into the nerdery and the facts and the findings and the truth and the reality of physics and cosmology and those things, that you would have just sat down with the worst version of worship you've ever had personally, because you'll be introduced to a new category by which you're supposed to interpret and understand God. That you've just had the worst worship experience that you're going to have for the rest of your life. Because hopefully you'll learn something else that brings you to that place of awe and wonder once again. That brings you to a place of his throne room once again. That makes you bow before him once again. Because for a lot of us, Jesus has become, in so many different aspects of our life, kind of this very congenial, opposed to any sort of conflict, just a sycophantic God that nods his head like a bobblehead, right? Like a lot of us, our Jesus is like Build-A-Bear Jesus. You know what I mean? You know what Build-A-Bear is? Think about a nightmare and then you put it in a store. So all these bears come to life, yeah, and they say things that you want them to say in whoever's voice you want to. Well, that's horrifying. We have Build-A-Bear Jesus, right? For some of you, your Jesus sits on your shelf, and it's like, this Jesus lets me do whatever I want, agrees with everything that I'm thinking, never has any issues with what's going on in my life. I can trick him because I do whatever I want to do. And then when I'm feeling a spiritual moment, I go to church and I do this whole thing over here. My Jesus is kind of brain dead. He doesn't care because he's just so stoked that I'm on his team that he doesn't really have any beef with what's going on. It's Build-A-Bear Jesus. That's not the Jesus found in Scripture. And for some of us, the Build-A-Bear Jesus that we have is a Jesus who's wholly unconcerned with the idea that anything in reality corresponds to physics or math or anything else like that. That God is like anti-science. And maybe you grew up with someone in your family, like came from a culture of belief is kind of the same thing as like voodoo religious belief. I grew up in the South, right? So I grew up where someone would be like, you better believe in Jesus or I'm going to stab you in the neck. That was like apologetics when I was a kid. It was like, I will kick you in the teeth if you say that God's not real one more time. Which is that's not a rigorous debate, right? That's a threat. But not that I need to tell you that. So we talked last week about, I love what, when we were talking through it, Thomas Nagel had a really interesting truth that he said. He's an atheist, but he said, it's not really that science has compelled us to accept that there is no God. It's that science in creating the scientific method and creating scientism, as it were, we have selected ahead of time that there's going to be no God. So then we create systems and beakers and methodologies by which we're going to come to a godless conclusion. So he said, it's not really that we use all of our reason, senses, and intuition in order to come to the best solution. We instead start with the truth that there is no God. I was just watching this the other day. Richard Dawkins was talking, Lawrence Krauss. Lawrence Krauss wrote a book called The Universe from Nothing. And I was finishing reading the book. The book's awful, by the way. It's just like a terrible book. Because it makes no sense. Because he equivocates nothing to mean quantum vacuums and it whatever. Neither here nor there. Just read the reviews of the book by other atheist physicists and they'll tell you, don't read the book. It makes no sense. But anyway, I read it anyway because I'm the kid who when you go to a Mexican restaurant and they give you the plate, and what's the lady always say? Don't touch it, it's hot. It's essentially an invitation for me to make sure you're not lying. You know what I mean? Any of you built like me, like sin nature, as soon as homegirl turns around, I am gonna touch that thing. And I wanna find out how hot, what are we talking here? You know what I mean? And if I get burned, I get burned, but I gotta find out if it's true. So I read the book, and in it he says, He says, oh, no. Christians can be extremely intelligent, but the commitment that we make as scientists, as soon as we get to the threshold of the door of the laboratory, we all become atheists. Then we walk in, we practice atheism, we come to atheistic conclusions, we have atheistic methods that bring atheistic solutions, and then when we go out, the Christians go and they worship that God is more powerful than they ever understood before, and we atheists walk away and we remain atheists. So really what we talked about last week is science is not at war with God, the conflict theory from history, that there's faith people over here, and then there's science people over here, and this is like a brainless endeavor of the heart, and this is like a rigorous endeavor of the mind. And this is actually a false conflict, perpetuated by a couple of different myths and perpetuated by a couple of different ideas in history. And it kind of just repeats itself for every generation, right? Maybe you grew up in church and you heard that the Catholic Church murdered Copernicus because of his heliocentric views, right? Or maybe you've kind of heard the idea historically that people were put on trial and they were executed for believing certain things about science because the church didn't like that idea. And I thought the same thing. And so when I was growing up, I just thought that the church was brainless and thoughtless. And if you wanted to worship God, you needed to check your brain at the door because it was strictly a heart endeavor. And what I found in then moving towards atheism and reading the constructs of the people that I looked up to in the atheistic community was that the idea was not just morally bankrupt, but it actually created more problems than it solved. So in thought, we call this explanatory scope. Explanatory scope is the power of any hypothesis or solution to answer all of the possible questions that the worldview could ask, okay? So I want to talk about this a little bit, then we'll talk about 3 proofs for the existence of God, and then we'll get into some Q&A. So you guys can feel free to do that. We have these microphones up here today. We normally do a text-in thing. I'm going to ask you either to raise your hand and we'll bring your microphone or to come up here for a Q&A because there were so many questions that we had last week that I wanted clarity on, but I didn't know how to ask the person for clarity because I didn't know who wrote it because it was anonymous. So that's what I'm going to ask as we get to the end. If you have one, write it down. And then I'm going to ask you kind of to come up and to ask that so we can have a dialogue about it. You don't have to be a Christian to ask that. And you might be a skeptic. You might not believe in God at all. You might be an atheist. I know that you're in this room. I know that there's people who don't believe, who are just interested, or you just are ready to make me look dumb in front of a room full of people. And so please come to the microphone so everyone can hear you make me look dumb. Or otherwise, it'll just be in your head, and then you didn't really get the moment you were waiting for. So do it publicly so that everyone can see what happens. And so we get into this notion called explanatory scope, and that's that any worldview, actually, it has to satisfy a number of different possible criterion. And so if you want to go, Chandler, to Yeah, not this. Yeah, keep going. Yeah. Okay, go back one. So the thesis is that, simply put, that the God hypothesis or theism is the best explanation for the world that we see. Okay? Anything in science, then, we test that hypothesis. We test it against a number of things, including different variables, other solutions, other hypotheses, and we find out which one's the most rigorous. Now, when we're doing something like, is there a God, we're doing a certain type of science that we have to be careful that we don't make a nomenclature problem, or that we don't insert ourselves into some sort of unsolvable paradigm or non-overlapping magisterial authorities. What I mean by that is, when we're talking about things like God's existence, we're doing a different form of science called forensic science, okay, as opposed to empirical science. Empirical science is the kind of science that we do when we say, how fast does an object fall in free fall inside of a vacuum given no air resistance? Well, the answer is 9.8 meters per second, something like that, right? I haven't taken physics in a while. It's like that, right? 9.8 meters per second, okay, in a vacuum. Now, you make a vacuum, however you do that, and you make objects fall, and you have a bowling ball and a feather, and they fall the exact same, right? And everyone goes, wow, that's empirical science, right? You get in the laboratory, you identify your variables, but then you create the conditions so that they're exactly the same. You can observe it, you can measure it, and you can repeat it. So it's empirically based science to say that objects free fall at 9.8 meters per second, assuming that there's no there's no air resistance whatsoever. Okay, this is empirical science. Forensic science is different. Okay, maybe when I said the word forensic, you thought of like a court case, and this is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about things like God's existence or historical events. Okay, so I used the example this morning in church when I was teaching, which is what is your evidence? Like, can you prove to me that Abraham Lincoln gave the Emancipation Proclamation? Well, the answer is, what do you mean by prove, right? Now, we all kind of walk in with a prima facie understanding that Abraham Lincoln gave the Emancipation Proclamation, that he was assassinated at Ford Theater in 1865, and all these other things. But if I told you to prove it to me, what would you do? You would start by going, well, I can't prove it to you, which doesn't logically follow then that I should go, well, then you shouldn't believe in Abraham Lincoln, right? It doesn't make any sense. Now, if you showed me a picture of Abraham Lincoln, you said, look, here's Abraham Lincoln, I can tell you, how do you know that's Abraham Lincoln? What if that's a picture of a guy with a hat and a beard, and someone labeled it Abraham Lincoln? You can go on someone's Facebook and write Abraham Lincoln in the caption. It doesn't make them Abraham Lincoln. What if they just did that with an old photograph? How do we know that's Abraham Lincoln at all? What if Abraham Lincoln was a pseudonym, like William Shakespeare was for a whole troupe of people who were writing plays? What if that's really the case? You have no proof that it wasn't. When we're doing things like forensic science, we're not asking what is ultimately indelibly provable. We are saying, what's the best explanation? You take all of the different things, all the different questions, all the different evidence, and then you're going to come up with a theory or an explanation that fits all of that evidence. And the question that you ask when you're doing forensic science, and when you're even in a philosophical setting, is this outcome more likely than not? Does it make the most sense, given all the data, that this is actually the explanation that we should come up with? What is the best explanation for all of the things that we see? Okay? So theism is the best explanation for the world that we see and experience. This is the thesis. It needs to be tested, okay? There is strong support, sound logic, philosophical truths, human experience, scientific, there's other things. Reasoning, it just goes down. But they're all good things. But the last one is called abductive reasoning. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Chan. The idea of abductive reasoning it's called inference from the best explanation, which means explanatory scope. We have to take all of the things that we see in the human experience and say, is there a thesis that satisfies all of these things? Okay, so go ahead and go to the next slide, Chan. I'm going to tell you guys a little bit of a story. This is Denny, Lenny, and Kenny, okay? You guys know these people? No, they're AI generated, so they're not real. It's kind of trippy. Anyway, there's Denny, there's Lenny, and there's Kenny. They're Egyptologists. Egyptologists hired by a rich man named Robert Chamberlain III to discover. He bought a catacomb in Egypt, and then he hired these guys to come and decipher the language on the wall. He gave them each $4 million if they were able to come to kind of create an alphabet of this new language. So they called the language Mut. Mut is an Egyptian form of hieroglyphics, and these guys were hired. The problem is that Mut's a very inefficient language. About 30 characters would equal like an English letter A. You would need 30 big, in-depth characters in order to equal just the letter A. So there was this whole wall full of all this inscription, and they thought, oh wow, we're gonna find like the King Tut's biggest secret, or we're gonna find Cleopatra's favorite snake I don't know, these are all things. And instead, after 2 years of research, spending a lot of Robert Chamberlain III's money and everything that happened, they finally cracked the code on Mut. And only 3 people on planet Earth even had access to the catacombs, and these 3 guys, Denny, Lenny, and Kenny, solved and figured out how to write the language of Mut. And so Robert Chamberlain was excited. He said, you guys come up to my house. He has a house on top of a mountain that's only accessible by helicopter. He's like a billionaire. And it's up in this cabin in the woods. There's no roads that lead up there. You have to fly a helicopter to get up there. So he actually gave each of them a helicopter, made them learn how to fly so that when they had meetings, they could meet at his house. So Denny, Lenny, and Kenny were like, for $4 million, bro, I'll do whatever you want me to do. So they go and they meet up there. And he's excited. Robert Chamberlain III's excited. He's like, what did you find out? And they're like, the whole wall just says the word entrance. And that's it. And Robert Chamberlain goes, well, it was at the entrance of the tomb. And they go, that's probably why they wrote entrance on the wall. And he's like, I spent $12 million in 2 years worth of grants and research and field study to find out that the language says entrance? So he's frustrated. So you can go to the next slide. He fires Denny, Lenny, and Kenny. This is also AI. These aren't real people. Is this weird? It's weird to me. Okay. They're sad, okay? Mainly because the guy that fires him looks like this, okay? This is Robert Chamberlain III. Also not real. Robert Chamberlain III is just rolling in money. He fires these guys, and they get pretty upset. None of this would be a big deal, except you just got hired as a forensic investigator and a detective on a case at Robert Chamberlain's house, which is in the middle of a forest, and there's no access to except for by helicopter, and you stumble across a scene that looks like this. This is Robert Chamberlain III's private resort. Also not real. This is what you stumble upon. And so here's all of our questions we have to ask ourselves. These are dog prints, okay? The fact that they're probably not to scale has more to do with my ineptitude than their actual scalability. On the ground, you'll see all of this looking like Egyptian hieroglyphics language, but it's not. This is moot. But all the floor, all it says is, you shouldn't have fired us. That's all it says. See, it's a very inefficient language, okay? Other than that, when you look around his house, everything else is kind of in place. Like, he's got jewelry, he's got money, he's got all those things. He's got a safe. The safe is there, the jewelry is there, everything else is perfectly in place. They found German Shepherd hair on the ground. So they think that whatever animal did the attack was actually a German Shepherd. And so you get up there and you're like this new detective and you've got to figure out how to make sense of all these things. And so the question isn't, prove to me who did it. The question is, what's the best explanation for what happened here? Now, you can use empirical data as a part of what you're guessing is your best explanation. You might find DNA here. The DNA might tell you who's been in this house, but it doesn't tell you that they killed Robert Chamberlain III. You might find things that have empirical bases to them, but at some point, a mind has to come to a conclusion. This is what minds do, okay? And they can be faulty and they can be wrong. It's a best explanation scenario. So you figure out, well, if only 3 people knew the language of moot, then at least we have our suspect list. Denny, Lenny, and Kenny. Nice, okay. So you go to start your investigation. You go, we've got 3 people. It was one of these 3 in all likelihood. And so you go to meet with Denny, you give him a phone call, and he's not returning your calls. But you find out the reason he's not returning your calls is because of this. Denny dead, okay? Apparently, he died in a sandstorm accident. Do people die from that? We don't know. You've never been to Egypt, neither have I. It is what it is. Maybe you have. We'll talk about it later. Denny died, okay? And on his tombstone, it literally says, now only 2 know moot, okay? So he's helping us out here. So now we've got Lenny, we've got Kenny. Time to call Lenny. We can't get a hold of Lenny either because we find out that 3 months ago, he was involved in an underground sting to actually kidnap dogs and to turn them into like fur coats, not unlike Cruella de Vil. And he really hates dogs, okay? So he's actually in prison right now. This is Lenny. He loves cats, right? He's one of those people. And he's really not a fan of dogs. So 2 of our 3 suspects have a really good alibi. The first one's better than the second one, admittedly. He's dead. The second one, during these murders, okay, so they were hired for 2 years, and then 6 months after they were fired, this is what happened. But Denny dies only a month after he's fired, and Lenny gets locked up 2 months after he is fired, and this murder just happened last week. And so one of them is dead, one of them is locked up, and so there's only one person available. So as an investigator, you're now left with this kind of smorgasbord, or this puzzle, if you will, to put together. The puzzle is full of these questions. Who is familiar with the language of moot? Okay, help me out. Denny, Lenny, and Kenny. Good. Why is there German Shepherd hair? You have to solve that, right? How did someone get up there? Why would someone do this? Why does he seem to be attacked by an animal? Why is everything else undisturbed? Why is there no witness of a hired pilot? Why is the artistry so professional? Okay, these are questions you have to ask yourself. Now, you come up and you go, you know what? I think it was a robbery. How about that? That's your solution. Now, it does satisfy some of these things because this asks the question of motive. And robbery satisfies, the screen's too big. So robbery up there is a viable solution. And if there was a puzzle piece that was wrapped like this, you could put it onto there and you would say, boom, we have motive. Motive is robbery. Case closed, end of story. Are there any problems with that theory? There are? Like what? Nothing was stolen. So you actually solved one part of the puzzle, but in doing so, you created a lot more issues. Like, why is it the worst robber ever? Is he the first robber ever who came and stole nothing? Conversely, another question on the robbery debate is, how often do you know a robber who also has its pilot's license? So if you have a helicopter pilot's license as a robber, it starts to unfold the idea of, do most robbers you know have pilot's license? And if not, then they have to hire someone, but there's no record of a hired pilot anywhere within the vicinity. Okay? And as such, if you were a robber and you had a pilot's license and you had a helicopter to not hire a pilot, what are you doing going to rob someone? You have stupid money. You've got enough yourself. And why would you come and why would you do that? And there's other things that you just have to go, don't worry about it. Why is your German Shepherd here? I'm not quite sure. Someone had a German Shepherd. That's what killed him. I don't know. So you go, okay, fine. That one doesn't check out. Let's try nature. Nature, goulet. It was just a dog broke in, murdered the guy, and went out. This isn't a homicide as much as it's an accident. Let's wrap up and go home here. Are you satisfied with that answer? No. If you are, you're a terrible detective because the last time I checked, German Shepherds, don't live up on the top of snowy mountains by themselves. Robert Chamberlain III did not have a dog. And not only that, there was something on the floor. The language of moot spelled out. Have you ever seen a German Shepherd use hieroglyphics? I haven't. Robert Chamberlain couldn't have done it. Robert Chamberlain himself didn't know moot. And so you actually are stuck. If you say any of these things, you might feel really great that you've solved the idea right here of motive or right there of motive or what's German Shepherd? Well, it's nature. So you solved that, but you left everything else problematic. So you need an answer that satisfies all of these things. And so you've already interviewed Denny and you've already interviewed Lenny, and then you finally get a hold of Kenny. He looks like this. Hey, wait a minute. Kenny, what's that in the background? It's my helicopter. Oh, and what's that? That's my dog. What kind of dog is it? It's a German Shepherd. Oh, what are you holding? It's my paintbrush. What do you do with it? I paint junk. Why is it red? It's my favorite color. Okie dokie. When we interview Kenny, did we just prove that he's the murderer? Nope, we didn't. Is Kenny the best explanation for what happened? Yes, absolutely. We have really good evidence to believe that Kenny is the murderer. Namely, everything on that puzzle checks out if Kenny goes into that middle section. But what if, this is good, Lenny, under the cloak of darkness, one night, uses the toothpaste and a toothbrush, and he starts to whittle away at his cell, the jail cell bars, and he escapes out the window, then replaces the bars in some sort of cat-like ability of his cat is able to do welding in his room. He gets out, he finds a helicopter, lying around like you do. He goes up to the mountain and he kills Robert Chamberlain, and then he goes back into his cell. He reupholsters everything that he broke, welds everything that he broke, sits back down. That's actually what happened. I can't prove to you that didn't happen, and I can't prove to you that Kenny did it. But would you take me seriously if I told you that I think it was Lenny? You shouldn't. Because all the evidence points against that. When we're doing forensic data, when we're doing forensic analysis, when we're doing forensic questions, when we're doing forensic science, we're not asking, what can you prove? We're asking, given all of the stimuli, given all the criteria, what's the best explanation? So the same way we have a puzzle for this whole thing, by the way, Kenny did do it, by the way. He's in artificial jail right now. Go to the next slide. We have the same set of questions that take place here for the next slide. Just the one after. There it is. We have the same set of questions, not the same set like German Shepherd and stuff like that, but we actually have a set of the need to be satisfied questions when it comes to our observable universe. Okay, so what explains the origin of life, biogenesis? What is the basis for objective moral values and duties? What is the best explanation for fine-tuning? Why is there an ordered and sustained universe, right? This doesn't make sense. In any other structure you have, like if you have an explosion at a nuts and bolts factory, you wouldn't expect this Boeing 747 to come out the other side. If you have a printing press factory and you explode it, if you have a perfectly formed dictionary, you would expect that chaos creates more chaos. It doesn't create order. So why do we live in an ordered and sustained universe? What's the best explanation for consciousness? What was the cause of everything from nothing? Why is there something rather than nothing? And anytime you satisfy one of these things, outside of theism, my contention is that you're actually creating as many problems as you're solving. So if you ask Bertrand Russell this question that Leibniz originally argues, why is there something rather than nothing? He says, brute fact approach. He says, there just is. The universe just is. It requires no explanation. It always has been. It always will be. So what does he argue? He argues the past eternal amount of time in the universe. So great, that satisfied. Why is there something rather than nothing? Well, it's always been here. good. You fixed the bottom of the puzzle. But in doing so, you created about 58 more problems. Like if you think that the universe has always been here, how do you deal with things like the second law of thermodynamics, where all energy in a system breaks down over time? And we still have usable energy inside of our solar system, inside of our universe, 13.75 billion years across, but there's still heat left over. Every year, the amount of salt in the ocean becomes a little bit saltier. Every year with the movement, did you know that the moon gets measurably further away from Earth every single year? Did you know that every single year the sun is slowly going out? We won't see it in our lifetime, but that's going to be the end of all things, the heat death of the universe. The idea that all energy in a system dissipates, it moves away, and it shrinks over time. It doesn't increase by itself. It all moves towards dissipation. And this is the law of entropy, which means if you had an infinite number of years in order for that heat death to occur, there should be no reason there should be any usable energy anywhere in the universe. So you'd have to disprove, first of all, the second law of thermodynamics in order for the universe to be eternal. So while you've satisfied this part of it, you've rejected everything we know about a guy who came up with a pretty set group of instructions about thermodynamics, who says, everything we've ever observed is that energy in a system breaks down and moves from order to chaos over time. And you need to make an exception and say, well, typically it does, but when universes are created, the opposite takes place. But that's fallacious. That's called the taxi cab fallacy. So when we're talking about the question, what satisfies all these possible stimuli, you can go to the next slide, Chan. It's this. The God hypothesis, I'm not proving anything to you. I'm making a hypothesis that theism is actually the best explanation for all of the stimuli that we see in our world. The universal origin, efficient causality, biogenesis, experience of miracles, ordered nature, contingency, consciousness, conscience, ubiquitous desire, religious experience, subjective morality, fine-tuning, time, degrees of perfection, apparent evil and suffering, and the aesthetic experience. If you argue any one individual thing to satisfy any one of those individual things, you also need that solution to not create more problems in all of the other categories. And the God hypothesis does not create problems in other categories when you solve it with the fact that it's God. This isn't God of the gaps reasoning. This is the argument that atheists make against theists, that you just say, well, God made it, that you don't have to think. Every one of these things is backed up by science and reasoning and sound logic. And the fact that God is the centerpiece that holds it all together, it's just intellectually lazy just to say, well, you're doing God of the gaps then. In the same way we didn't know where rain came from for a while, so it was God crying because men were unfaithful to their wives, so God cried over it. That's why we had rain. But now we found out that there's pressure systems, and there's clouds, and there's condensation, and there's this cycle of water, and now we know, so therefore there's no God. This is not what we're talking about. So we're going to take 3 of these ideas tonight, which is the universal origin, the existence of the universe, and fine-tuning. And we're going to offer evidence for why God is the best explanation for these things that we see. The first one comes from a guy, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. You know him? He's a dude. And he's looking fierce. That's his favorite headdress, by the way. I don't know if that's true or not, but he asks this question. He's considered the last universal genius. Okay, this is before the Industrial Revolution, where you had things that kind of worked for you. So he was well-renowned as a mathematician, philosopher, scientist, and diplomat. The guy invented calculus, okay? He actually invented calculus contemporaneously with a guy named Isaac Newton, but people actually liked Leibniz's system of notation better. It's the one that we're still using today. So if you don't like calculus, Christians are the problem everywhere. Don't you agree? He's a lifelong Christian. He had a major lasting impact in every category. And he asked a very basic question. And he said, the very first rule of astrophysics is ex nihilo nihil fit, which means out of nothing comes nothing. Out of nothing, nothing comes, right? So if the universe was just nothing, but now we can see something. You, me, chairs, leptons, protons, neutrinos, mountains, fish, duck-billed platypuses, the Horsehead Nebula, stars, galaxies, whatever it is. We see all these things. Why, on a reasonable basis, is there something rather than just nothing? We take something for granted, but pretend that you didn't take something for granted. Pretend that you were there sitting and staring at the infinite nothingness of past time, and you went, Is it more likely that nothing remains nothing or that nothing becomes ballroom dances and proms and university systems and the eye and subatomic? What's more likely in that case? So Leibniz's argument is saying, when you ask a simple question, why is there something rather than nothing, that God is actually the best explanation to satisfy this. I've just asserted that. That's an ad hoc argument. Now I'm going to back it up. Here's how. Go ahead. Okay. Sorry, I coughed into the microphone. That was attractive, I'm sure. William Lane Craig uses this analogy, and I think it's pretty profound. And that's, imagine right now while I'm talking, if a floating blue orb just appeared right here. And I couldn't get you to focus on what I was saying because, well, friggin' floating blue orb appeared right here, right? If a blue orb appeared right here, but it was the size of a baseball, you would all go like this, right? Even when there's other things, right? I think sometimes as you're sitting in like the congregation, you don't realize that I can see everyone's eyes in the room. So sometimes people will like look at something and I'm like, I heard it too. And I saw everyone's head go, you know what I mean? Like someone falls, everyone's like, So I know how hard it is to keep someone's attention when there's a floating blue orb somewhere. I don't know exactly how hard, the floating blue orb principle, but I know how hard it is to keep attention. So there's a baseball-sized floating blue orb and you all stare at it. And I go, what's your problem? And you're like, floating blue orb. And I said, don't worry about it. I don't know why I'm from the Bronx all of a sudden. Don't worry about it, okay? It's just, I got a problem for you. Accents are getting weird, but don't worry about it. You ask, where'd that thing come from? I said, nowhere. Who put it there? No one. What's its explanation? There isn't one. Just don't worry about it and look at me. That's actually not an answer to the question. That's a non-answer. It's like the same thing if you're sleeping in the middle of the night and you hear a noise outside of your room and then you tell yourself, I'm sure it was nothing. But what do you mean? What do you mean when you say it was nothing? Do you mean nothing as in the absence of anything, as in the opposite of anything existing? Do you mean the word nothing when you say, I'm sure it was nothing? No. No thing is the universal antecedent that says no thing. It was no thing. There's one thing we know about no thing. No thing doesn't make noise. Nothing is what rocks dream of. That's what Aristotle said. The dream of the rock is nothing. So this is what Lawrence Krauss, who I just read a whole book on, I could have had a 5-minute review. I'm going to give it to you right now. Lawrence Krauss argues that nothing is actually something. It has properties, it has balance, and all it is net zero energy and quantum vacuum states. So he says the universe did come from nothing, but nothing is a quantum vacuum. And you're like, Krauss, no thing. So the question you have to ask Krauss, which I want to ask him, is if the opposite of everything is quantum vacuums, then what do I do with actual nothing? What's that the opposite of? Does that make sense what I'm saying? Maybe it doesn't, but anyway, never mind. It's nothing, something outside my window. You know it's not nothing, but what you really mean by that is it isn't gonna attack me, or it's not a murderer, or it's not a bear. So when you say, I'm sure it was nothing, you don't mean that. You mean, if it's anything from like a mouse to a raccoon to a pine cone, I'm good with it, but I don't think I'm in immediate danger. That's what you mean by nothing. You don't truly mean nothing because nothing doesn't make noise. Nothing doesn't have properties of interacting with things that create vibrations that reach your ears. You don't mean the word nothing. So if I said it doesn't have an explanation, that doesn't solve what the blue orb is doing there. So the argument is that anything that exists has an explanation for its existence, right? Now, we can all agree that a floating blue orb would require an explanation, and if I told you no, it doesn't, you would think I was high. Now, imagine if it wasn't the size of a baseball, but instead, 2 minutes later, it grew to the size of a basketball. And if something baseball-sized required an explanation, but then it became as big as a basketball, then would it require an explanation? Of course. Nothing about a blue floating orb growing in size takes away its need to be explained. So what if that glowing orb went from being baseball to basketball to now the size of the planet? Now would it need an explanation? Yes, size doesn't negate the need for an explanation. So what if I told you it was as large as the universe itself, 13.75 billion years across? That's how big that orb was. Now would it need an explanation? Yes. So Leibniz's argument is if something's simplistic, if everything requires an explanation, the universe has to be explained as well. So the argument flows like this. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. I've asserted that. I've got to prove it. I recognize that. The universe exists. This is prima facie. Therefore, the explanation of the universe's existence is God. Okay? He argues this by a couple of basic, fundamental, prima facie means obvious to everyone, premises. The first one being, you can go to the next slide, Chan, that everything that exists has an explanation that falls into one of two categories. Everything is either necessary or contingent. Necessary or contingent. Necessary things are those things that could not have failed to exist. Necessary things exist by the nature of their nature, okay? An example of this would be numbers, okay? The number 7. If no human ever existed and you went to Mars and there were 7 rocks, if no human ever dignified those or qualified or codified those as sevenness, there'd still be 7 of them. The idea of numbers and sets of numbers and states and properties would still be there even if no humans ever existed. They exist by their own nature, like rules of non-contradiction. No one invented those. No one had to. And if all the universe was this one little thing, then something cannot be A and not A at the same time. You don't have to come up with that. That's a truism that no one invented. It exists out of its own necessity. It's just the way things are. It exists by the rule of its own nature. Very few things are like that, and almost all of them are abstract entities. Numbers, data sets, properties, states of being. They can't really affect anything. However, the other category of things is contingent. Contingent things are things that exist but could have failed to exist, okay? You and I are contingent beings, which means we can imagine a world in which I didn't exist, okay? We can imagine a world in which you didn't exist. In fact, I could give you the formula to create a world in which I didn't exist, which was that you would just keep my parents away from each other. Okay, and I'm gonna get this weird because it's weirder for me than it is for you, I promise. If they didn't do that, I wouldn't be here. So it's very easy to imagine a world in which I'm not here. And any individual thing's explanation has to be found outside of itself, okay? Because what if I told you that I think this podium made itself? Is that reasonable? No, it's actually a tautology. Because in order for this podium to make itself, it would have to predate itself in order to create itself. So it would have to exist before it was created in order to create itself. So we get rid of the idea that things can create themselves. So I'm contingent because I can't make myself. I require a transcendent or external or outside of me reason for my existence. And the reason for my existence isn't nothing. I didn't come into none of y'all were sitting here tonight and there was no Chris Hilken here and then there's Chris Hilken. That's not how things come into being. If you think that is how things come into being, then you have to ask the next question, which is, why don't we see that? Like, why have you ever been walking on the street and a horse just went boop, right? A ballerina, boop. Oh, a building, boop. So if you say things pop out of existence from nothing, then you're also qualifying that happens, but only very rarely and only in the case of universes. But you have no reason to believe that, okay? So contingent things can't cause themselves. They require a transcendent or outside of themselves cause. Can nothing create contingent things? No. Ex nihilo nihil fit, which means out of nothing, nothing comes. So you might go with a brute facts approach, Bertrand Russell. It just is. This podium, this blue orb requires no explanation. It just is, which is a non-explanation, and no one takes it cogently, okay? So the question Leibniz is asking then is he's saying, is the universe necessary or is it contingent? In other words, do we have any reason by the nature of the universe of assuming it has to be here? What about the properties of the universe require it to exist? We don't have any. The universe itself is contingent, The universe itself, just like that orb getting bigger and bigger and bigger, requires an explanation. And because it's not necessary, we can assume a world where it didn't exist. It's contingent, which, following by parity of reasoning, means that it has an explanation for its existence. Following the deductive line of thinking, that explanation of the universe can't be what? It can't be part of the universe. The universe can't create itself, so we're looking for something outside of the universe, which we call transcendent. But then what's the universe made up of? Anything the universe is made up of can't be the solution to its existence. So our universe is comprised of space, time, matter, energy. This is what makes up our universe. So we can't say something material made it. We can't say something inside of space made it. We can't say something inside of time made it, because Einstein's general theory of relativity told us that space, time, and matter all came into existence at the same point. How do we know that? Because if you have space without time, when is it? If you have matter without space, where is it? If you have space without time, when is it? If you have space without matter, what is it? They are all correlative. They all require each other to exist. So the answer and the solution, the transcendent cause of the universe, cannot have space, time, or matter. It can't be bound by those things. So we're looking for a culprit to explain why our contingent universe exists, and that culprit must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful enough to create worlds, intelligent enough to do so, with a personal mind that chooses a will and volition in order to accomplish it. That being must not be contingent themselves, but must be necessary. When you lay out all of those factors, and you tell even a basic entry-level theological student that you're looking for a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-intelligent, personal being, what do we call that? God. That's what everyone means when they say God. It's the maximally great being. He has maximal great-making properties. This is what we mean when we say the word God. And so science is saying, here's all the things we're looking for in the culprit of the explanation of the universe. Go to the next slide here. Keep going. When you open up the pages of Scripture, the God that reveals himself in the text, thousands of years before we even understood the criterion that we needed, God is identified in Jeremiah 23 as spaceless, timeless in 2 Timothy 1:9, immaterial in John 4:24, powerful in Jeremiah 32:17, intelligent in 1 John 3:20, personal in Isaiah 46 verse 10. I'm giving you one verse for each of those things, and there's many of them. The original necessary uncaused cause is a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, intelligent, personal being, or what we mean when we say the word God. Therefore, the existence of something rather than nothing points to an explanation transcendent of the universe itself, which must have all these properties, which is what you and I mean when we say the word God. Therefore, God exists. Did I just prove to you God exists? Nope. I proved to you, given everything that we know in science and all of our modalities and all of our pedagogy and all of our common space-time theorems and all of the ways that we perceive everything, that I would postulate to you that God is the best explanation given all the criteria. That's the argument from contingency. Going to the next one. This is the argument from the beginning of the universe. It goes like this. It's the Cosmological Argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has cause. This is a modus ponens argument, which means that the two axioms follow rightly. The conclusion follows rightly from the two axiomatic phrases. And if we can prove premises 1 and 2 correct, then the conclusion follows as such, which means in order to reject a modus ponens argument, we have to deny the antecedent. Okay? So, we look at this and we say, can you prove, or is it more likely than not that everything that begins to exist has a cause? Is it more likely than not that the universe began to exist? Go to the next slide. This guy he's named Stephen Hawking. You might have heard of him. Here's what he said. In the last 50 years, something ironic is when you hear from these philosophical minds, from Antony Flew to Bertrand Russell, they all had the same hypothesis. The further we grow in space-time cosmology, the more that we'll reject the idea of God. And something really strange happened because the opposite took place. So before we had a lot of our modern day understandings of past space-time cosmology, he said this: if you could prove a point of creation, this is when everyone believed in a steady state universe. eternal, always here, that kind of thing, or oscillating universe, big crunch model, all that jazz. Maybe you care, maybe you don't care. He said a point of creation would be a place where science broke down. If you could prove a point of creation, one would have to appeal to religion and the very hand of God. He said this confidently because every working model at that time had the universe existing eternally. Why did it have it existing eternally? Because a guy named Georges Lemaitre came by, he was a Catholic priest, and he said, I think there was a big bang. He didn't say that. He said a cosmic explosion from a singularity by which we understand all life and all matter and all principle and all space. A guy named Fred Hoyle, Sir Fred Hoyle, because he was knighted, came by and made fun of him on a radio program and said, you dumb Catholics, you don't know anything that you're talking about. He made fun of this idea of a singularity sparking all space, time, and matter. And he said, malevolently, you big bang enthusiast. He was making fun of Catholics and believers, saying, you think there was a big bang, but we know that that's not the case. So the term big bang is from someone making fun of a believer who came up with the model for it. So sometimes as Christians, we get afraid of the Big Bang, not recognizing that it actually was born inside of a church. It was criticized by the scientific community because the scientific community understood this. If you can prove a point at which creation started, at which all the thing that we know, space, time, and matter began, before that there was nothing. And what can nothing do? Nothing. Which means you would need something transcendent of the universe in order to make nothing turn into everything. Or as the book of Genesis says, in the beginning God said, let there be light. So, in the past 60 years, past 50 years, there's been leaps and bounds progress in the field of cosmology. Namely, BRIDGE is an acronym I'm using on the left side to help me remember it. The Borde-Blankin-Guth theorem. Alexander Blankin stipulates through this theorem that he looked at the way the universe is expanding. Our universe is expanding right now at a rate of 68 kilometers per second per megaparsecond. So that means if our universe is expanding and you push the reverse button on it, there was a point at which everything came into one spot. His theorem states that any universe that is on average expanding cannot be infinite in past due to that principle. So the Borde-Blankin-Guth theorem rejects the idea of a past infinite universe. A guy named Arnold Penzias came to this red light shift in the universe and recognized that the universe was in fact expanding and had a definite past where it began. The infinite events paradox, this is also called Zeno's paradox. Philosophically speaking, we reject the idea of an infinite number of past events because it's a ridiculous idea, okay? So if I told you, it hurts my brain, okay? So if I told you that today was present time, this is the present time, how many yesterdays would we have to have before we got to today? If the universe is eternally past, how many yesterdays would there need to be before today? An infinite, which means if you're waiting an infinite amount of time, an infinite number of yesterdays, there would be no such thing as present time because you would always need one more day before today for today to get here. If I told you that there was a library that had an infinite number of red books, an infinite number of blue books, and then I said, I'm going to take out all of the red books, how many red books would I have? I'm going to do this again. I told you there's a library. A library has an infinite number of red books and an infinite number of blue books. And then I told you, let's take out all the red books. How many red books would I have? How many blue books would be left in the library? So how many books would now be in the library? Now all of the books are numbered. Odd, even, odd, even. Now I'm going to take out all of the odd numbered blue books and leave all the even numbered blue books. So now how many blue books am I holding? An infinite number. And how many blue books are left? An infinite number. Okay, fine. I'm going to put all of the blue books back and all the red books back. Do I have any space? I, for some reason, in some parts of my brain now have 3 times as many books as I possibly did, but at every juncture I took out half of what the book should be, but I still had the exact same number the day before. There's no such thing as an infinite number of actual events. We can only get theoretical infinite going to the future. We cannot have theoretical infinity, an actual infinite number of events in the past, because if there's an infinite number of events in the past, we would never get to present time. You don't have to understand that, but you're going to think about it when you're going to sleep tonight. You're going to go, That guy. Okay. We also discovered cosmic microwave background radiation. A guy was looking for aliens. He heard a noise in the satellite, and he thought that the birds were nesting in it, but then realized it wasn't aliens he was listening to. It was heat left over from the original explosion of the universe. So the idea of an infinite past is problematic because all heat would have dissipated in that period of time because you need an infinite amount of time for heat to cool to nothing, to absolute zero or to 0 degrees Kelvin, and we still have measurable amounts left over. The COBE satellite went up and measured to the 100,000th degree exactly how temperate, and they calculated and they postulated that if there was an explosion, it would have exactly this heat marker, and they calculated it to the 100,000th place, and guess what? They found it perfectly as it would be if there was a singularity that exploded. Radiation, general theory of relativity, the co-relativity of space-time and matter, and entropy. All energy in a system breaks down over time. All of these discoveries, or all of the theoretical physics that have been done in the last 50 years, have led people to believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that the universe is not past eternal, but had a definite point at which it began. Atheists, secularists, Christians alike. The Big Bang model, which was originally used to make fun of believers, is now taken as absolute fact in almost every scientific community. The only ones that don't argue postulations that have zero basis and no evidence, like the multiverse theory, quantum vacuum states, things like that. Okay? So, that tells us, Alexander Blankin, the guy who originated the BVG theorem, here's what he says. It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince unreasonable men. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of the cosmic beginning. Why is this a problem? Because he understood what Hawking understood, and that is the idea that if there was a point at which everything began, space-time matter, before that there was nothing, and nothing. Out of nothing, nothing comes. So, Robert Jastrow, this is one of my favorite quotes. He's an agnostic. He was the first director of the Goddard Space Institute for NASA. This guy's, he's just the smartest, maybe the smartest person that existed at the time. He wrote this: the essential element in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis is the same. For the atheist scientist, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer its highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. So Jastrow says, we gave the people who discovered that there was a universal beginning a Nobel Prize in physics and said, so there was a point at which everything began. And if I could have told you that, right? Like if you open up Genesis, the very first verse was so remarkably mocked by the scientific community. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, which is now, he's saying, it's the same story. In the beginning, a transcendent something created everything that we know as heavens, Uranus, heavenly bodies, and earth. The accounts of modern science and Genesis read the exact same. In the beginning, the transcendent cause created everything that we know. So we get Nobel Prizes to pull ourselves onto this rock of new knowledge. And who's sitting there? A whole bunch of theologians who are like, what took y'all so long? We've been saying this for thousands of years, right? The fine-tuning of the universe, okay? So this is the third argument. The argument goes like this. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. What do I mean by fine-tuning? What I mean is that in order for you and I to exist, there's 3 different levels of complexity that we have to get to. The first is that the universe has to be ready, it has to be a good petri dish to create planets that can sustain life. So the force of gravity has to be set perfectly. So when the original explosion happened, all of these laws, Planck's constant, and the Pythagorean theorems, and all the nuclear density of objects, and the way that things, the nuclear density of things, and atomic masses, and the way they all play together, in an instant, all had to be perfectly set. This is what Stephen Hawking said. He said, within a picosecond of the explosion, everything should have collapsed on itself and there should have been no universe. Unless there were such perfectly finely tuned variables that the universe continued to expand at a rational, reasonable, and life-permitting rate. So there's 3 levels of infinite complexity that go into you and I existing. The first is, what are the odds by random chance that the universe would be the type of universe that would hold planets, and the planets, the type of planets that would hold life, and that life would be able to evolve into complexity. That's called fine-tuning. What we understand now, having done all of our research, go ahead to the next slide, is that the universe is actually set up with these hundreds of dials. But on these dials, it isn't like numbers 1 through 10. On any individual dial, there might be 10 to the 20th numbers. There might be 10 to the 120th little dials on it. And what we're finding that's so interesting is that if you take one of those dials, let's take the force of gravity, okay? If the force of gravity were stronger, then no complex organisms would exist. And in fact, at the moment of the Big Bang, when everything went, if gravity was stronger, by 1 part in 10 to the 40th, it would have all gone like this. Nothing would have ever existed. But if it were any weaker, it would have gone, and it would have had no power for your nucleus and for your cells and for their membranes to stay together and for us to experience the world. It is set so perfectly in order for us to exist here that if you had a ruler that expanded the entire known universe, which is 13.75 billion years across, and you had a ruler, right? Just like a little, little one of those little guys, contractor dudes, and you put a ruler and it expanded the whole known universe, 13.75 billion light years. 13.75 billion light years across means that if you traveled at the speed of light, it would take you 14 billion years to get across the universe. That's how big the universe is. If you don't know how fast light travels, if you load a proverbial gun with the speed of light bullet and then said bang, by the time you finish the word bang, your bullet would have gone around the world 6 times and hit you in the back of the head. That's how fast light travels. At that speed, it would take you 14 billion years to get from one side of the universe to the other at that speed. And if you had a ruler on your journey that stretched the whole thing, this is a big friggin' ruler, okay? Gravity is so perfectly set in our universe that if it was set at an inch mark right here in the wide breadth of our whole universe, and you moved it 1 inch to the left or 1 inch to the right, there'd be no life anywhere in our universe. 1 inch in a 14 billion light year wide cosmic ruler. That's how perfectly finely set it is. And that's not even the most ridiculous number. To have a low entropy universe, or one where order moves to chaos in a way that is reasonable for the sustaining of life, is 1 in 10 to the 10th power raised to the 123rd power. There are only 10 to the 80th atoms in our whole universe, okay? So in order for you to, let's take something similar, or a little bit similar to it. Let's just take the cosmological constant, okay? The rate of expansion, the growth of the dark matter of our universe, this cosmological constant, okay? Which cosmological constant originally was Einstein trying to get away from a creation event. He fudged the numbers and he divided by 0. That's a problem. He admitted later in his life that this was the biggest mistake that he made, but he was also trying to get away from a cosmic beginning. It's in his paper, okay? You don't need it. You can go read it, okay? It's like a Clevin. You guys ever seen The Office? Kevin, he's like, you put in a Clevin, you can be home by 7. He put in a little fudge factor so he could make his science work out, which it shouldn't have. He admits it later on in life because he's challenged by scientists. Anyway, so just take the cosmological constant, okay, or the expansion rate of the universe, how fast it's going out. If there's 10 to the 80th atoms in our universe, the odds of something like that happening by accident is infinitely more improbable than if you painted one atom in the entire universe, 13.75 billion, 14 billion light years across, you painted one atom in the whole cosmos red. Then I blindfolded you, put you on a speed of light rocket, let you travel throughout the universe wherever you wanted to, blindfolded, and at one point you had to grab one atom in the entire universe. And remember, an atom is to an orange what an orange is to planet Earth. That's how small atoms are. So even if I told you to blindly pick the right red atom on my Bible, no one would take that bet. Even if I offered you a great sum of money and death was on the line, even if everyone in this room got to guess 14,000 times, you wouldn't hit it. That's how tiny atoms are. And that's just on this one book. Think about every rock on every planet, on every solar system, on every star, on every galaxy in the entire universe, 10 to the 22nd planets in our whole entire universe, and their nuclear density and an atomic value, and one of them in the whole universe was painted red. And you had to blindfold find that one red atom by random chance. That is 1 in 10 to the 80th power. For just the cosmological constant to have done it accidentally would be infinitely more improbable than you going on that endeavor. And that's just cosmological constant. That's not arguing the force of gravity, which is that 1 inch on the whole ruler, or the flatness problem, or the electron to proton ratio, or Hubble's constant, or the low entropy universe, which that by itself nullifies everything. And reminder that mathematical impossibility is 1 in 10 to the 50th power. So if we just said, how improbable is it that Hubble's constant, just by itself, was set on accident perfectly, you would say it's mathematically impossible. Just for this, it's mathematically impossible. Now, in order for a universe like ours to exist, and you need all of these different things to exist, I've given you 8 dials. Cosmologist Hugh Ross and a number of other mathematicians now believes there's 322 dials that are set like this by which we now have life in our universe. 322, just for the universe to be the way that it is. I can show you a list of them. I made it this week because I'm the coolest person you've ever met. And I have no friends. Okay. This is just that the universe would be a seedbed for planets that can support life. Then, next slide. What are the odds that a planet like Earth would be able to support complex life? Now we're talking about the improbability of planet Earth being the way that it is. Well, you would need to have a 23-degree tilt of the Earth. 23.7 degrees, it's actually tilted at 23.5 degrees. 23.3 degrees, no life on planet Earth. 23.7 degrees, no life on planet Earth. You'd have to have an elliptical orbit, planetary protection of Jupiter, a proper star, which is a G2 red dwarf star, which is one of the least likely stars. Galactic location in the spiral arm of a Goldilocks, of a growing universe or a growing galaxy. Plate tectonics would have to be in place. So the odds of a planet like Earth being able to support life, it should say 1 in 10 to the 166th power, but it says 66. So you go, well, there's probably other life out there. The odds that a planet could support life is 1 in 10 to the 166th power. But there are 10 to the 22nd planets. But if you just did the math with just these dials, the odds of there being life on any planet is 1 in 10 to the 144th power. So when you ask me, do I think there's aliens out there? I say no. Do I do it theologically? No. I do it scientifically. Unless God really wanted aliens and he's got like this little pet planet that he's just like kind of chill with. No. By accident, absolutely not. Then we get to the idea of what are the odds of complex life. We've got the field to have universes that have planets. And we've got the planets to support life, but that's just microbial life or single cellular life. What about complex life? Now you've got this. What's the chance that insulin comes up by random chance of mutation? What's the odds of any life of any kind is 10 to the 40,000th power. The odds of complex intelligent life like you and me, not even talking about the universe first of all, and then the planet being ready, but then that we would be here by random chance, is 1 in 10 to the 1 followed by 12 zeros. It's enough that Sir Fred Hoyle, who coined Big Bang Theory and made fun of it, said, the likelihood of the formation of life from inanimate matter is enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. And if the beginnings of life were not random, they must therefore have been product of purposeful intelligence. More on this next. Go ahead. He's brilliant, but it's too much. Sir Fred Hoyle, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seems to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion beyond question. Next slide. Francis Collins, he maps out the human genome, and he says this: to get our universe with all of its potential for complexities or any other kind of potential for any kind of life form, everything has to be precisely defined on this knife edge of improbability. You have to see the hands of a creator who set the parameters to be just so because he was interested in something a little more complicated than random particles. No one looks at those numbers. You need to take all of those 322 constants, multiply all of those by each other to come up with a number that we couldn't even fathom. Then you have to multiply that by the probability of a planet being able to sustain life, which is 1 in 10 to the 166th power. Then you have to multiply that by the odds of complex intelligent life, which is 1 in 10 followed by 12 zeros, multiplied by and then you have to multiply all those things together. And the number, it's not reasonable. Did I just prove to you that God existed? Absolutely not. I think given the datum, the idea that this was on purpose is far more likely and a better explanation than we just won the cosmic lottery. And you can propose M theory, you can propose a bubbling universe, but you actually run into all those theories. BVG theorem applies to any number of universes and the complexity of such still, but you're arguing against Occam's razor. Say, well, there's an infinitude of multiverses and there's so many different planets and a planet spitting out machine. You've just taken the problem back a step, which is where did those things come from, first of all? And secondly, when you see something, when you argue something infinitely more complex to make sense of something far simpler, you've betrayed Occam's razor. So, next slide. Given all these questions, this is Stephen Hawking. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to me to be very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. Okay, I've kicked that horse, it's pretty dead, okay? Literally, the most common arguments that you hear from atheists who look at these numbers and don't argue from necessity, which no one argues that really anymore, is either the lucky us hypothesis or panspermia. Panspermia is the idea of a multiverse where aliens from another dimension or another universal planetary system jumped into, through wormholes and other things, into our universe and seeded life on the back of crystals and put them in caves, and that's how we have complex life. You see, at some point, when you go that far to get away from God, it's what Romans 1 says. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities and his divine nature have been clearly seen from what has been made, so that man is without excuse. For what God made is plain to them because he has made it plain to them. Namely, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen from what has been made, so that man is without excuse. Okay? When you consider all these things, these are the things that punched me in the gut one day when I was studying it, and it led to like a deeper worship than I ever experienced before. It brought me back to awe and wonder. And the more that I understood about our universe, in fact, the deeper in love I was with God, and the more confused I was that he cared about me at all. And I have not proved anything about the Bible. That's next week. Next week, we're going to ask the question, is it reasonable to believe that the Bible is God's word? That it's true, that the events happen, that it's valid? That'll be next week. But I think there's really good reason. In fact, I would say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the God hypothesis is the best explanation to satisfy all the criteria that we see. At this point, we'll take a few questions for Q&A. I'm going to have the band go ahead and come up and close us in. Just a time of worship and celebrating this God who's present with us. But I want to, if it's pushback, if it's questions, if it's comments, these microphones will be up here if you have any in particular that you want to ask. I have... people are texting on the thing. I recognize that it might be easier to text. The only reason is I want to be able to interface with something or be able to ask a clarifying question. So if you want to ask a question, you can even raise your hand and I can bring you a microphone if that would be easier, if you don't want to get out of your row. If you have any questions, comments, pushback, or any issues with what was going on, or maybe a clarification of something, anyone? Bueller? Yeah. So Dan? Where do all these massive numbers come from? Where do they come from? So Hugh Ross is a cosmologist who works with a number of mathematicians. And what they do when you actually look at the numbers is they're doing a very liberal study of all of these things. Like, what are the odds that any planet lives in the spiral arm of a galaxy like the Milky Way galaxy, which is expanding? He puts it like 1 in 1,000. which is not fair. It should be 1 in 10 million, but he assigns these very small numbers to them. So this really isn't contended in the scientific community. No one looked at this and goes, fat chance. Everyone agrees with this. It's just what do you do with that conclusion? So if you want to read a book called The Creator and the Cosmos, there's a book called The Hidden Face of God. There's a book called The Science of God. There's a book called The Argument from Irreducible Complexity. There's there's a lot of things that would support that, but this is a guy who's kind of given his life to assigning these values to it and understanding these things. But those big numbers, especially on that first screen that I showed you, those are just kind of universal knowns. So, good question. Any of those books will help you out too. Other questions? Yeah.
If Zeno's paradox is not plausible, then how can we believe in movement?
How do you mean? What do you mean? Why would Zeno's paradox affect the belief in movement?
Because if something there's an infinite number of possibilities, then how can something moving through space not just exist there in a certain moment?
Because Zeno's paradox is the specific example of the library system. The actual argument is that there's not an infinite number of finite things or events. So it doesn't, when it's saying that, it's talking about past temporality. It's not saying that anyone has the potential for an infinite number of possible conclusions. It just means there is no reasonable way to argue that there's an infinite number of past sequential events that lead to today, nor could there possibly be in a room an infinite number of anything. You can't infinitely divide a line in half. It's fun to think about that theoretically, but it's actually it's an argument ad absurdum. So his whole purpose is you can't get to, this is what William Lane Craig talks about, you really can't get to, Lawrence Krauss actually agrees with this, you can't start talking about an infinite number of things that aren't infinite into some sort of futuristic thing, or you can say infinite as a satisfier to something, but there's no such thing as truly infinite number of finite things, events, movements, or anything else like that. So not being able to have an infinite number of them wouldn't disqualify someone's internal ability to move or to be or to any of those things. So I guess Zeno's paradox is specifically talking about the books, or he uses hotel rooms. What if you had a hotel room that was full of an infinite number of people and all the hotel room people in odd numbers came out and you inserted? So that's the paradox of the word infinity actually begins to make a category error, but it has no bearing then on anything that we're doing now moving forward. It just has to do with eternal pastime. But I think it's a really good question. Other questions? Yeah.
You can veto this if it's not related, but
I can veto it? That's kind of neat.
can true randomness and does true randomness exist?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a theological question, right? I mean, well, if I'm begging the question here, assuming that God exists, which I think right now I'm not in the idea of trying to convince you. This is special pleading. Okay, it's a fallacy. I'm telling you where I sit. I'm not trying to be objective. There is a God. I think you all should know him. I think that Jesus is better than any potential worldview you could possibly imagine. I think the Bible supports that claim. We'll talk about that more next week. But do I think there's true randomness? I don't think that all events in the universe, that God directs every single thing that someone does and forces them to do it. So I don't know if you're talking about determinism or if you're talking about fatalism or if you're talking about the idea of actual true randomness. Do I think there's randomness in the ether? Yeah, I think we can paint it as different things. If by saying that God has a sovereign will over all things, yes, but I don't think he's individually concerned with that. My dad found out last year that his dad wasn't his real dad, okay? So my name should be Christopher Kearns, not Hilken, so my life's a lie, which is fun. But my dad was a first career architect, very successful, and then gave it up and went to pursue Lutheran Pastoral Seminary. And his dad, who he never knew, had the exact same life schedule that he did. Is that random? Yeah. Is it not? Yeah. I don't care. It doesn't. Nothing in that philosophy negates the fact that there could be true randomness. Whether I believe in that actually, it would be a tertiary issue for me, but I think it's a good question, yeah. Yeah.
If we set aside the idea of natural selection, do God and then macro evolution have to be mutually exclusive? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense for sure. You have to define terms, which is why I love that you're able to talk about this in person. If by macroevolution you mean the accidental mutation of genes, which leads to an increase in genetic information, which leads to beneficial byproducts, which increases this, which then changes species. Do I think that's reasonable without God? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying if you set aside that and say, yes, that's unreasonable, but we still have the evidence.
Oh. So are you saying outside of my belief in the scriptures, do I find evolution as a worthwhile worldview scientifically?
I guess the argument you'd have to put aside, like, taking Genesis literally, but in your mindset, is that acceptable or are those mutually exclusive? Macroevolution through God.
Macroevolution, theistic macroevolution would make total sense to me. Accidental macroevolution as a deistic worldview, that this is just what happened when God wasn't paying attention, I think does conflict with Scripture. Anything else? Does your brain hurt? Mine hurts. Yeah. How do I not believe in aliens? I mean, that's like a good question. If you would prefer me to believe in aliens, it's like I don't have any stake in it. I could believe in aliens. I think the math would stipulate that if those are the numbers needed for complex intelligence, we would argue that any kind of super intellectual intelligent life out there, if that's what we mean by aliens, exists. If that's the stipulations for intelligent life to exist, the fact that Earth has that, assuming just on the numbers that another planet would also have that, Earth got lucky enough, quote unquote, if you're coming from a strictly secular point of view, that for that to be somewhere else, I wouldn't think so. I have no evidence to think that there would be aliens. No one has ever shown anything. People have done great, the SETI project, NASA, they've done a lot of stuff. They haven't found anything. But if they did, I would go, neat, aliens, and I wouldn't have any issue with it whatsoever. I I literally hold that as an open-handed thing, and it's just my personal opinion more than anything. It wouldn't shake my faith. I would have no problem as a theologian thinking there's aliens out there. So I don't personally think it, but I don't think there's Sasquatch either. And if you showed up, you'd be like, sweet, that's great. Yeah. Nice. Yeah. That feels like a great segue into next week, which is like all I'm going to talk about next week is theism, why Christianity. I hope that I'll give a convincing argument for that, but that will be what we spend our whole time doing next week. Yeah. 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 Do you believe in the extinction of dinosaurs? Extinction of dinosaurs? Yeah. What do you mean, do I believe in do I think they're still out there? No, I don't think that's what happened, but I'm okay if you do. I'm what's called a gap theorist, which means there's a time marker in Hebrew in the first and second verses of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, which is telling a whole different story than the creation of the world as its renewed creation. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, 13 billion years. Now the earth was formless and void, and the darkness. So I think the gap between verse 1 and verse 2 could potentially be a period of 13.745 billion years in which the universe expanded, and we see complexity, and we see radioactivity, and we see all this other stuff. And then God is going to make this portion of earth suitable, or this portion of the universe suitable for people to live on. Now the earth was formless and void, and darkness of the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So a gap theorist would say that, or he would say the difference between how long were Adam and Eve in the garden before they fell? Anyone know? No one knows, right? Long enough for there to be cities and all these other things. So could that have been a period of time by which all of human history exists? Good, I don't know. Could that have made answers for the dinosaurs? Personally, here's what I think happened. God created the heavens and the earth. There was a long period of time. He then reformed the earth into what we see at that point. Dinosaurs and humans had a lack of overlap with one another. The global flood came and pushed everything down, which is the sedimentary letters, which is why I don't reject evolution on the basis of a philosophical point of view. I do so because it leans into uniformitarian thinking, and I think that's a ridiculous way of thinking of our cosmos as uniformitarian, that there's no catastrophe, that there's no accident, there's nothing. So to take this layer of dirt and say this equals this many millions of years, so we found a bone here, so the bones are this old, but then you date the dirt by the bones and the bones by the dirt, and you do that same thing, and radioactive dating is just like, in 1985 when Mount St. Helens erupted, we found this rock that we watched the magma come out of it, and it radioactive dated to like 25 million years ago, and so the whole system's like kind of faulty and messed up. So it's not really something that I put a stake in. It's an open-handed issue for me, but I struggle for the cogency of evolution. I agree with Darwin. The best argument that can be made against the theory of Darwinian evolution is the fossil record. That's what Darwin said. So that's my argument for it. If evolution is true, great. My hero is of faith, believe in theistic evolution. I'm great with them. I just personally am not convinced by it. So, yes.
How does God's omniscience relate to our own free will?
How does omniscience relate to free will? Okay. Am I going to drop this? You don't know. What if you did know? Do you know? Tell me to drop it. Did you know I was going to drop it? You didn't? Okay, how about this time? I'm the kind of guy who always drops books when someone tells me, okay? Tell me to drop it. Did you know I was going to drop it? How could you know that? What did I reveal to you? I revealed something you didn't know about me, that I'm the guy who drops books at all times. In doing that, you knew exactly what I was going to do before I did it, and you telling me to do it didn't make me do it, which did not mean that you didn't understand what I was going to do before I did it. So, does God's omniscience automatically qualify that he makes us do everything? No. God can know exactly what's going to happen, and every infinitesimal part of your life that plays itself out, he can know that, first of all, because he's not bound by time. So he looks at my life, he doesn't go along with it going, wonder what's happening next. He's outside of it. So God looks at time like this and can insert himself and see whatever he wants at all times. So he can know what's going to happen. He's already at the end of time. He's also at the same time at the beginning of time. He's outside of it. So when God makes predictions about the future, he's not going, I hope and think. He's going, I'm already there. And this is what it's going to look like. So God can know everything I'm ever going to do in my life without making me do those things in my life. It's a theological framework. I'm not a predeterminist. I'm not a fatalist. I'm not none of those things. So I don't think that. I think that doesn't make sense. Sovereignty, or at least divine sovereignty at an infinitesimal level, means God makes you do everything you've ever done. Divine foreknowledge is different than knowing what you're going to do. You don't know that much about me, right? What's your name? Sam? What's my middle name? You don't know. Is that your friend sitting next to you? Yeah. How well do you know her? Pretty well. If I said, would she rather have a burrito or a burger, which one would she rather have? What do you think? Burrito? Yeah, for sure. So now, imagine with the way that you know her, you're able to predict certain things, but now imagine you knew her perfectly. Inside and out, every single thing, every hair on her head, you knit her together in her mother's womb, which you didn't do. You thinking about what she was going to do and knowing that, your knowledge of her would lead to the idea of you knowing exactly what she was going to do without you predicating and making her do those different things. Does that make sense? Those two things they're actually different than each other. His foreknowledge and his bearance on our will are not the same thing. One more question? Yeah, front row.
So you had a slideshow that showed like the dials, I think is what you called it, with,
The dials?
or I don't remember the name, but it's
Those are called anthropic principles.
chances of certain things happening, and you basically made the point that it was a really, really low chance of everything being perfect for the universe to be able to be created.
Yeah.
How would you know or be able to prove that we didn't kind of just get lucky and
I didn't prove that. I proved how unlikely it is. I didn't prove that it didn't happen. So if one is comfortable with those numbers, which, 1 in 10 to the 100 trillionth power, that we struck a chord. And again, some people go, well, we had an infinite number of chances, but the universe only expanded one time. So all those things had to be perfect once. The universe set its dials once. Planets formed once. Gravity was set once. Planck's constant was set once. Planetary systems were set once. Gravitational pull was set once. Proton-electron ratios were set one time. You didn't get an infinite number of times. You only got one shot. So it's in my opinion, it's unreasonable to believe that we got lucky, but I did not prove that God did it with those numbers. I just said I think it's more likely than the antithesis that that's what happened. So good. We'll keep dialoguing with this. Next week, there's a little bit of a preview of what's going to happen. We're going to dive into what makes this book the Word of God. Is it the Word of God? Is there reason to believe in that? What do you do with some of the difficulties of Scripture? But we'll kind of close out our time here by just worshiping. And this is an invitation to all of you guys here afterwards. If you want to get more involved here at Young Adults, maybe you're interested in serving on one of our teams. There's a lot of setup that goes into this. If you want to kind of go next level and get to like meet people and find community here, we're going to have like an informational meeting after here in this room next door, right over there behind that wall. And if you want to get involved, or if you're interested in interning next year here at College Ave, we want to give you some information about that, and we'll go through all those things. But we'd love for you to get more involved in what's going on here, to have your handprints and your fingerprints on it as we continue to reach people for the gospel. So let me pray for us, and then we're going to close in a song before we head out there. Sorry, stop your thing. God, thanks for the glory of your majesty, for the ridiculous improbability of a world that just came to be, but instead, as Romans 1 said, you're not trying to hide. You're not trying to trick us. You're not playing divide, hide, and seek, but instead, you've built the world so complex in order for us to seek you inside of it, to worship you through it, not in spite of it. So God, we look at those things and realize that the same God who invented the cosmological constant and the expansion rate and the proton ratios and the universe and the constants that govern it is the same one that knows me by name, and that you call me son, and that you call us sons and daughters if in fact we are found in you. Would that inspire our singing? Would that inspire our worship and not hinder it? We pray all these things in your name. Amen.